Hi, Adam Marsland here, host of Pet Squares. Welcome back. It's been a while since episodes, and I apologize for that. I'll explain in a minute. But first, we're going to be featuring the last piece of the puzzle, the last of what I call the Big Seven, the longtime Beach Boys members. He enters our story at this point. He is, of course, the one and only, the inimitable Bruce. Not that Bruce. Wait a minute. So apparently not the one and only, but this Bruce Johnston, who joins the band in April 1965, replacing a supposedly ailing Glen Campbell. We'll get into that in a little bit. And so since we've been doing a couple of these special one-off episodes, I thought as we've gotten to this point in the chronology, I'd like to stop and take a moment to talk about this guy's career. Because if Bruce Johnston, who, as I said, joined the band in 1965, is still playing with the band as of the taping of this show in April 2023 at age 81. If you go to a Beach Boys concert now, you'll see his role is sort of as a cheerleader. He's playing a largely inaudible keyboard. He's singing in the background, clapping a lot, futzing with his microphone, wearing shorts, and you could be thinking this is just a guy that's along for the ride for his name recognition. And there's some truth to that, but the fact is that this guy was in at the beginning of the invention of California rock, and he had a fascinating career before the Beach Boys. He had a fascinating career during his period away from the Beach Boys. Very interesting cat, and so I wanted to take a little time to explore the pre-Beach Boys career of Bruce Johnston. Now, before we get into that, a little bit of housekeeping. It's been a while since the last Pet Squares episode. Apologize for that. I have been working as a full-time musician in Cambodia for the last 9 months. That's taken up a lot of my time. Also, the last several episodes of this show and of the other show I do here, Adam Walks Around, have been pretty labor intensive and a little bit higher standard of production quality than the previous episodes. They've taken more time, but we've been rewarded with greater viewership, which has been great. In fact, this is the first episode on the Karma Frog 1 channel to occur after the channel has been monetized. So we are now making $7 a month for the ads that you are seeing down here and down here, which you would have seen anyway, even if we weren't monetized. So that part's kind of cool. So I'm hoping to have a little bit more time to devote to the channel. And the last thing we did with Pet Squares was our mini-sode, Did the Beach Boys Play on Their Own Records? That and also the Brian's Breakdown episode have become very, very popular, and they've just got a whole new audience for the show, and I'm really excited about that. I do want to quickly say that there was a mistake, a very small one, on the Did the Beach Boys Play Their Own Records video. I'm embarrassed about this because the whole point of that video was to combat inaccuracies about what the Beach Boys did and didn't do on their records, and I tried to dot every I and cross every T, but I did get one small thing wrong. I said that Dennis did not play drums on Fun Fun Fun, only tambourine. I was called out by this by a drummer in the comments thread and also by Mark Lynette, the Beach Boys' own engineer. Dennis and Hal both played drums on Fun Fun Fun. Dennis played the straight beat, Hal played the fills, and I just messed up. I'm sorry about that. That is the only error that anyone has called out on that show, so I think everything else is good to go. I'm sorry about that. If I could go back to correct it, I would. This is the best I can do. It's just one of these things when you're doing a YouTube show. I do want to make it as professional as I can, but you know, this isn't a full-time job. It's supported by that $7 a month and by the generous Patreon donations and PayPal donations that you guys put in there. And I again want to thank you for that. That has kept the show going through some tricky times. I want to thank you for your patience as the pace of shows has slowed. If you want to help with the show, keep it going, there is a link down in the first comment where you can become a producer of the show. Okay, with all that out of the way, let's talk about this guy, Bruce Johnston. Now, Bruce was adopted, and he was adopted into a family of the president of the Rexall drug chain. And this back 50, 60, 70 years ago was similar to what CVS or Walgreens is now. In fact, I think it got bought out by Walgreens. Very, very big deal. So Bruce was raised in money, and he grew up in the fairly affluent Brentwood area of West Los Angeles. Those of you that know the Los Angeles area know that this is, you know, there's some money there. And from an early age, Bruce was trained in classical piano. And he also went to the Interlochen, I think, Center of the Arts, which is a performing arts summer camp. And if you don't know what these are, I actually went to one in the 70s when I was a kid, and they're pretty cool. It's where kids that want to have careers in the creative arts and be performers go to kind of mix with other people of the same interest. You know, if you're a musician, you'll form a kind of a stage band. If you're an actor, you'll act in a play or whatever. And this was great for me. It's actually where I formed my desire to be a musician, because up until that time I had wanted to be an actor. But anyway, I can attest that these kinds of environments can really crystallize your desire to take your creative path seriously. And it obviously did this for Bruce, because what we're going to see in the show again and again is a desire to put himself in a position to be around talented people, be a part of what they're doing, learn from them, and advance. If there's something in your life that you want to do, whether it's creative or with your job or whatever, this is how you do it. This is how I was able to learn the things I did, was working with some really, really talented people that knew a lot more than I did. So the story of Bruce Johnston and this whole process really begins in September of 1956, when Bruce, at age 14, enrolls in University High. University High is one of these schools that occurs around Los Angeles, where you have a disproportionately large amount of people that go on to bigger and better things. A lot of future rock stars and actors and things like that. And there's a really, really good book called Hollywood Eden by Joel Selvin that delves into this whole social world of people that kind of bumped up against each other and went on to bigger and better things. And that segues me into some of my sources for today's show, which beside Joel Selvin's book and some of the interviews he did around that book, I relied a lot on Becoming the Beach Boys, the website for the book, the excellent book written by Jim Murphy. There's some really good stuff on there about Bruce Johnston that I quoted liberally from. Mark A. Moore, who is the world's leading expert on Jan and Dean, was kind enough to provide source interview material with Bruce Johnston for my use in this show. He also is the author of Dead Man's Curve, The Rock and Roll Life of Jan Barry. I also used some very key interviews that Bruce did for the, I think it's a cable access show, it ran for a long time, called Art Finds Poker Party, from August 18th, 1990, which had Dominic Priory's well-known surf music historian, his participation, and they kept that focused on Bruce Johnston's career outside the Beach Boys. Also, an interview Bruce did for Prim Films, and of course, the input of Beach Boys sessions expert Craig Slowinski and Beach Boys historian Andrew Doe. So I relied on all of them in pulling together the information for this show. So, back to University High School. Now, one of the key people Bruce Johnston crossed paths with in University High was Jan Barry, later to become famous as Jan of Jan and Dean. And in fact, Dean was there too, as was Arnie Ginsberg, who was part of Jan and Arnie, which was what predated Jan and Dean, and they were all part of a vocal group Jan Barry had called the Barons. And this was gathered around Jan's garage, where Jan, who was also the son of affluence, had some high-end, for the time, recording equipment, and he would do kind of fake radio shows and record his own garage doo-wop records that would sound roughly like the songs of the time. And he would make these fake radio shows with his own music, and he would play them at school for parties and things like that. And this became a situation around which the social group of musicians coalesced. And this is where Bruce first got his taste of the music world. And I want to use Bruce's own words from Mark Moore's interview to explain how this came about. So this is Bruce Johnston speaking now. Let's say 56, 57, graduating to being invited to Jan's garage from just being a guy who knew him, because my sisters knew guys his age that got their driver's license before I did. I knew him on kind of a neighborhood level, but it was a big deal to get invited up there to Jan's garage. It was very important for me, for part of my formation as a music guy, to have gone up to KJAN, Jan's sort of fictitious radio station come garage recording studio. Sandy Nelson, a local drummer about which we're going to talk quite a bit, was just about out of high school then. He would come and play. So I'm going up to Jan's to sing, and Sandy Nelson comes and plays drums. It sounded really good. Jan could just pound it out on the piano. He had an upright, and he would get musicians to come and play at his garage studio. He had, I think, an Ampex 601 tape recorder or something, and a good microphone, and you could get reverb on it. Reverb being a very big deal in those days to sound like a record. You could record things and sound like the radio and maybe put out a record someday and meet girls. That's how simplified it was back then. He had lots of people. He had his vocals guys, the same name as the guys in his Y Club, called the Barons. That's what his musical thing was. And being the fly on the wall, a young guy, I would come and play a little piano. What I got from Jan was a guy who could kind of get in sync with that with what was on the radio and do his version of it. I'm just a kid, knowing nothing. Jan's a little ahead of me. The most important thing for me, knowing Jan musically, was not his music. It was how to control the room and the studio and actually pull something together. He would pull vocal parts together pretty much on the money for the time. I learned a lot by being a fly on the wall and watching and occasionally singing something and playing something on keyboard. And we'll see this again and again with Bruce's advancement as a musician as we go through this story. So not too long after Bruce enters this hothouse environment of University High, Bruce starts his first band, and it has some fairly significant members. The guitar player is a guy named Phil Spector, and the drummer is Sandy Nelson. Their manager is a guy named Kim Fowley. And the band's called the Sleepwalkers, and they start what Bruce says playing in a 100-mile radius for about $30 a show, which mostly went to gas. Bruce is diplomatically called working with Phil Spector. He said he was an interesting guy to work with, but he also credits Phil with, even at that young age, being very interested in arrangements, having a lot of ambitions. Kim Fowley is kind of a legendary fixture of the Los Angeles music scene. He's dabbled in a bit of everything, a bit of management, a bit of production, a bit of songwriting, even singing once in a while. Got a bit of a checkered reputation in some areas. I'm not going to get into that, but everyone's got a Kim Fowley story. I actually have one of my own. I was 26 years old, living on someone's floor in North Hollywood, and at 4 in the morning I get a call from Kim Fowley, and he rambles on for an hour. And to this day, I don't know how he knew who I was, how he got my number, or what he was talking about for an hour, because none of it made any sense to me. So anyway, that's my Kim Fowley story. But Kim Fowley is going to have a pretty key part in Bruce's early career because Kim writes a song that Bruce, Sandy, and another guy named Dave Shostak demo, and they're invited to pitch this to a local impresario. I'm going to be using that word a lot in this episode, impresario, named John Dolphin. And he had an office in Hollywood, so this is Bruce's, as he says later, first day in the music industry. He is 15 years old. The date is February 1st, 1958. Why do we know this date? Well, I'll tell you in a minute. They go down to the office and the door's locked, so they have to wait outside. And while they're waiting outside, they strike up a conversation with a young guy named Percy Ivy, who is a singer. And he is there to get his recordings and $250 back from Mr. Dolphin. So when Bruce and the gang are called into Dolphin's office, Percy Ivy follows them in. And before Bruce gets a chance to pitch their song, Ivy and Dolphin begin having a heated discussion. And at a certain point, apparently, Dolphin pulls out a switchblade. And they say, never bring a knife to a gunfight. Well, Percy Ivy did not make that mistake. He came packing, and he put a number of holes in John Dolphin, who keels over dead in front of 15-year-old Bruce Johnston holding his demo tape, I assume. Sandy Nelson runs to get the cops. Dave Shostak nurses a ricochet bullet wound. And Bruce apparently is chatting with Percy, making plans, future music plans once Percy gets out of jail. That's Bruce Johnston's entry into the music industry. So if you go to a present-day Beach Boys concert and see Bruce clapping and thinking, what's that guy about? You think he has no badass bone in his body. Just remember the first day of his career in music, he saw a guy shot dead over royalties. So Bruce, undaunted, but being unable to pitch his song to John Dolphin because of Dolphin being dead, very quickly makes some progress. Now, right after this happens, there's a pretty significant event that happens in Bruce Johnston's orbit. Remember we talked about the Barons and Jan Berry and Bruce's classmates, and Jan being the central figure in a group of musicians that were recording up at his house, and including Dean Torrance, with which he would later form Jan and Dean. However, Dean had gone off for a hitch in the military, so Jan was recording with a different friend named Arnie Ginsberg, and they had made a duo record, basically, again, for their own private enjoyment to play for their classmates, called Jenny Lee. And they had gone to a pressing plant to make what's called an acetate, which is basically a one-off vinyl record, I think to play at a high school dance or something like that. And they, this record was heard by another local impresario named Joe Lubin, who happened to be at the pressing plant. And he ran a record company called Arwin Records. And Lubin thought this would make a really good record fleshed out with a full band, so he basically got Jan and Arnie's parents to allow him to sign them, and then got a band overdubbed onto Jenny Lee and released it, and it became a huge national hit. Now, Bruce apparently parlayed this association into his own deal with Joe Lubin and Arwin, and he will be recording his own songs with them in 1959. He and Sandy are now playing in a morphed version of their band without Phil Spector called Kip Tyler and the Flips, and Bruce makes his first record backing up Kip Tyler in November '58 with a song called She's My Witch, backed up with Rumble Rock. And they became what Bruce called the house band in the area for people that didn't have a band, and they would back up people like the Everly Brothers, Eddie Cochran, and also Richie Valens. So we'll talk a little bit more about Richie Valens in a minute. In the meantime, Phil Spector gets rolling with a band called the Teddy Bears and invites Bruce to play on a session for a song called To Know Him Is to Love Him. Bruce, unfortunately for him, had other plans that night and declined to play in the session, and thus missed out on being a part of that smash hit, which launched Phil Spector's career. But once again, Bruce continues undaunted, and by early '59, he is split from Tyler. Then he gets a deal through the Jan and Arnie introduction to Arwin Records and starts making his own records. His first credited single is a song called Take This Pearl, and it's credited to Bruce and Jerry, not Bruce and Terry, which is the duo Bruce would record with a little bit later. He also did a duet with a lady named Judy Harriet for a song that appeared in an obscure movie called The Ghost of Drag Strip Hollow. So this is in early 1959. Bruce is already starting to get his name on some records. But the big event happened in August of 1959 when Sandy Nelson, the drummer of this group of people, had an idea for a while to do a pop record that was centered around the drums. And he was able to convince another impresario, a guy named Art LeBeau, who had just started his own label. And the resulting record, Teen Beat, became a huge national hit, went to #4 in '59. And Bruce Johnston not only played on it, along with a guy named Richie Polidor, who would later become a pretty well-known producer. Bruce not only played on it, but he has claimed, and there's no reason to doubt him, that he also qualifies as songwriter and arranger by virtue of how the song was put together. So Bruce, now 17 years old, has now played a very direct role in a huge national hit. Now, not long after Teen Beat, Bruce and Sandy got involved in what is arguably the first surf band, and more arguably the first surf vocal group, the Gamblers, who released a regional hit called Moondog, which is arguably, we're arguing a lot on the Pet Squares show today, which is arguably the first rock song, and was actually later covered on Surfin' Safari, the Beach Boys' first album. So the Beach Boys covered Bruce Johnston on their first record. So again, another example of Bruce being in at the very genesis of this style of music. So Bruce was in there with the Gamblers making surf music as early as 1959. They had also, ahead of its time, one of their songs was called LSD 25, ooh, psychedelic. Again, 1959. Bruce also around this time recorded with Richard Berry, who was the guy that wrote Louie Louie. So yeah, he's there with a bunch of things early on. You recall that he had signed earlier with Arwin Records as himself. And it's worth mentioning that Arwin Records was owned by Doris Day, the actress, and her husband, Marty Melcher. And through going down to Arwin Records, Bruce Johnston met Marty Melcher's stepson, Doris Day's son, a guy named Terry Melcher. According to Bruce, Terry was pumping gas across the street. I don't know why he would be if he's the boss's stepson, but that's the story he tells. But anyway, Bruce and Terry became friends, and Terry would later play a significant role in Bruce's development, and also, of course, with the Beach Boys. We'll get to that in a minute, but first we need to go through the next step in Bruce's career, which is after making another single called Geronimo with a band called the Renegades, which involved Kim Fowley, Sandy Nelson, and also Nick Venet, who was to become a Capitol staff producer and, of course, produced the Beach Boys' first 2 records. So, of course, again, we see Bruce working with people right from the beginning that would go on to be important players in California music and in the Beach Boys world. So after Geronimo is released and doesn't go anywhere, in fall of 1959, Bruce becomes staff producer at Delphi Records, which is the record company owned by impresario Bob Keane. And Delphi became kind of a legendary label. They did a lot of good work in the late 50s, early 60s. They also were revived later and did some worthwhile stuff in the 90s. And some friends of mine have worked with Delphi, and they're just good guys in the rock and roll story. So Bob Keane hires Bruce Johnston to be staff producer. And again, this, for anybody that's looking at advancing in your career, just as an aside or something like that, this is a good way to go about it. This is how it happens, because this was a win-win. Bruce was a hungry young kid, eager for experience in the industry, obviously very, very talented, but green. Bob Keane, I'm sure, didn't have a lot of money, but he had a label that needed product. So he hired Bruce to be his factotum, the guy that made this stuff happen. It was a win-win for everybody, and just like we see with Bruce again and again, Bruce uses this learn-on-the-job situation to become more proficient as a producer, musician, and as a singer. So one of the first things that happens for Bruce at Delphi is he gets the assignment to produce and co-write an album for a singer named Ron Holden, who had just had a hit single, which Bruce was not involved with, called Love You So. So Bruce gets basically to produce an album and practice writing and learn his craft. And he also works on several singles, and also at this time he's doing demo sessions for Herb Alpert, who, again, he at that time is sort of a fledgling impresario. There's that word again. You can see, by the way, telling the story, just how active the scene was and how many different people were popping up here and there making independent records and creating this vibrant scene where early rock and roll flourished in the California, what we call now California rock and roll, California music, came to be. And so Herb Alpert's one of these guys at that time. And in those days, you would often, we didn't have home studios, you know, most people didn't, except Jan Berry, I guess. So you would hire somebody to record your song for you, which you would then pitch to other people to do the proper record. So Herb Alpert was hiring Bruce Johnston to be that guy for him. So yet again, another connection Bruce makes with someone that's going to go on to bigger and better things and learning his craft from somebody that is already a little bit ahead of him and knows what they're doing. And, you know, this is how I learned most of what I learned. I was really, really fortunate in my associations, and had I not worked with people like Darren Sahanaja or Stu or Earl Mankey or some of the Beach Boys and things like that, I would have stayed at a certain level as a musician. And especially in your formative years, the more people you can line up with that really know what they're doing and that you can kind of ride their train for a while, it's going to really help you. And Bruce internalized this lesson from the beginning, and you can see this again and again and again. He gets the opportunities, he takes them, he learns, he keeps going. His next assignment for Delphi, he assembles the last Ritchie Valens album, Ritchie Valens in Concert at Pacoima Jr. High, which comes out in December 1960. You'll recall that Valens was a friend of Bruce's. Bruce backed him up on numerous occasions, and Bruce tells the story of the last time he spoke with Valens was at the Pomona Fair, and Valens said to him, I want you to hear this new record I did. It's a Mexican dance song, and the other song is a song I wrote for my girlfriend. I'll play it for you as soon as I get back from tour, or you'll hear it on the radio. And of course, that is the tour where Valens perished in a plane crash with Buddy Holly and J.P. Richardson, the Big Bopper, in February 1959. So a year and change later, Bruce goes through archival tapes for his old friend and cuts together the album that Delphi then releases posthumously. In March '61, again working for Delphi, Bruce acts as an arranger for another big hit, Those Oldie But Goodies by Little Caesar and the Romans, with Barry White on drums. Bruce does not play on that, but he does the arrangement, basically says he dropped off the papers and went home. But now Bruce is associated with yet another hit, so he's doing good. And June 1962, Bruce cuts his first album for Delphi. It's called Surfer's Pajama Party. And remember, June 62, this is right when the Beach Boys are getting rolling. This is right when the surf music thing is just starting out. And Bruce is already he's starting to move into this area. And he makes a whole album in this sort of surfing realm and gets yet more experience at his craft. And let's remember, Bruce Johnston was an actual surfer, and I believe still surfs to this day, or did until recently. I don't know if he's doing it now. But when people say Dennis Wilson was the only surfer in the Beach Boys, it's not true. Bruce Johnston also surfed, and I think Mike surfed a little bit. But at any rate, Bruce sees the potential in the surf thing pretty early on, makes this record, and then Terry Melcher comes a-calling. Remember, we said Bruce had hooked up with Terry Melcher when he was over at Arwin. Well, Terry had gotten a job at Columbia Records working A&R and needed somebody to help him staff the studio that Columbia Records had. And so Bruce pulls Bruce into that situation, and they become producers for Columbia, which at that time had very little going on in the teen music field. So this was another learn-on-the-job playground for Bruce to basically get an education, putting together records for other people, and also building time to do his own stuff. Bruce and Terry, before they started making records under their own name, made numerous knockoff records under various names, like the Catalinas, the Hot Doggers, the Custom Kings, the Rogues, the Sidewalk Surfers, the Surf Stompers, and the Vets. The first record that they worked on was under the name of the Hot Doggers, and that came out in mid-1963. You remember we talked about that in the Did the Beach Boys Play on Their Own Records video, when we said we believe that possibly Carol Kay's impression that she played on Surfing USA comes from her having done a session on the Hot Doggers album. Well, that was Bruce and Terry. And when Bruce and Terry started working on these sound-alike knockoff records, this brought them into contact with the Wrecking Crew, the LA session musicians that were doing the rounds at the time. And so they met Hal Blaine, they met, Bruce had actually already played with Steve Douglas, the sax player in a prior band. But they got to know all these people, and in fact, Hal Blaine speaks glowingly of Bruce Johnston's organ playing in his biography. So Bruce's talents impressed the pros at that time, and at the same time, Bruce made a lot of musician connections, which played an important role in how he got asked to be in the Beach Boys. So while Bruce and Terry are getting on-the-job training at Columbia Records, they get the assignment to produce a band called the Rip Chords, who had already had a minor hit. And I don't know who decided to do this, but the decision was made that the Rip Chords were going to get into this new surfing thing that was catching on. And stories differ as to how this occurred, whether it was because one of the band members was out of town, or whether because the original two guys that formed the Rip Chords didn't have the vocal chops to do vocal surf music. But basically, Bruce Johnston and Terry Melcher wind up cutting their next record for them. It's a song called Hey Little Cobra, and it becomes a massive hit. And so now Bruce is on another top 5 hit, this time as a vocalist. And this seems to have inspired Bruce and Terry to do their own recordings as Bruce and Terry, no longer as the Custom Stompers or whatever the hell they were calling themselves. So then Bruce and Terry would continue to record with the Rip Chords, or without them depending on who you talk to, but continue to make records as or with the Rip Chords, and make records as Bruce and Terry. And with the Rip Chords, they scored 5 chart singles in all, including another top 30 called Three Window Coupe. And Bruce and Terry, on their own, as Bruce and Terry, had 2 chart singles, Custom Machine and Summer Means Fun, which are now acknowledged classics of the vocal surf music genre, even though they only made it to the lower reaches of the Hot 100. But by the end of '64, Bruce had chalked up quite a number of successes, both as a producer, vocalist, and a session musician. And a lot of the Bruce and Terry stuff is great. They never made an album during their initial run, but there was a compilation album that came out in the '90s that cobbles together a lot of the stuff that they did, both as Bruce and Terry and under all these other pseudonyms. And it's very, very good stuff. And it features Bruce a lot more heavily as a vocalist and a musician and as a writer than his work with the Beach Boys. And you could get a sense of how talented he was and how good he was. Also, not to take anything away from his partner, Terry Melcher, speaking of inventing California music, because once Bruce joined the Beach Boys, Terry would go on in his role as Columbia staff producer and as producer of the Byrds' first albums. And, you know, pretty much that's a huge contribution to rock and roll right there. And of course, much later, Bruce and Terry would reunite when Terry becomes the Beach Boys producer in the 80s. So both guys served very, very well by their apprenticeship at Columbia Studios. Bruce would later recall that they were basically in there every day, billing for time, whether it was arranging or production, and they got the chance to try all kinds of different things on someone else's dime, and it was an incredible education in doing stuff that they loved. And once again, we see Bruce taking advantage of an opportunity and using every chance he gets to up his game. Another notable success for Bruce around this era was co-writing and singing a song called Beach Girl, which was Pat Boone's attempt to make kind of a Beach Boys-like record, and it's actually a really nice record, and it reached the lower reaches of the charts. Now, Bruce and Terry kept recording in various configurations up into the Pet Sounds and Smile era, and some of the stuff's really fun. I want to flag a song called Here We Go by Bobsled and the Toboggans, which the conceit of this is that the surfers have gone up to the slopes and are competing with and annoying all the skiers with their superior skiing prowess. And it features a sky-high vocal by Bruce and a chorus that goes, ski, ski, look out for that tree. And considering Sonny Bono was a contemporary when all this was going on, that was advice he sadly should have heeded. Anyway, so we now tick into 1965. Bruce and Terry are pretty well established over at Columbia Studios. And Columbia Studios is right across from Western Recorders, where the Beach Boys are doing a lot of their stuff. And as is natural for people in the same line of work, in proximity to one another, they start hanging out at each other's sessions. Bruce is at the session for Wendy in '64 for the, I think, All Summer Long album. And Bruce also, in his role of doing all these sessions for Columbia, has gotten to know all of the local players and you know, sub-players, and basically everybody that is working as a musician in LA is in Bruce Johnston's Rolodex. So this brings us to early April 1965, when Glen Campbell is touring with the Beach Boys, and for some reason he becomes unable to do some shows that they have booked in the Southeast. Now, this is a little peculiar, and I'm gonna do a little bit of sorry, Bruce, I'm gonna do a little bit of a rabbit hole here on the whole Glen Campbell thing, because it's a little, anytime you hear multiple stories about something, a lot of times that means there's a story that's not being told, and I'm not going to get all conspiracy theory on you, but the timeline here is a little suggestive because Glen Campbell's on the road with them in March, and then they're home. They do a show in Anaheim on the 5th, and then Bruce Johnston's first show with them is on the 9th of April in New Orleans. And this came up so suddenly that Bruce apparently had to wear Al Jardine's stage pants on stage. Like, there was no warning for this whatsoever. So it's been said that Glen got sick, or that Glen had some other professional thing that he had to do. But what's interesting about this is everybody agrees Bruce did a couple of shows, and then Glen comes back, and then Bruce stays on the road with them. He runs lights, and Carl shows him the songs on the bass. And I'll get into the whole how did Bruce learn the bass thing in a minute. But what's odd about this is apparently Bruce's first full-on show with the Beach Boys is on May 19th. But who is their opening act on May 19th and the next slew of shows for the rest of May? Glen Campbell. Glen Campbell's right there. He's opening the show for the Beach Boys. So what happened there? Well, we see that Glen Campbell was on the road with those guys before May 19th, but then we've got on Andrew Doe's Bellagio 10452.com website an entry that says the vocals for Guess I'm Dumb, which was Glen Campbell's new single that Brian Wilson produced, were done on April 19th when Glen was apparently on the road. Now, the vocals on Guess I'm Dumb, I believe, were done in the previous year, so I don't quite understand what vocals these were. Was Glen on the road with the Beach Boys, or was he back in LA recording Guess I'm Dumb? I don't know, but the fact that the first thing Glen does when he stops touring with the Beach Boys is open for the Beach Boys makes me think that there were a lot of this was getting his single set up. Like the Guess I'm Dumb single comes out the 7th of June, right after this. So it seems to me that, you know, Glen was offered the full-time gig with the Beach Boys, which he turned down, understandably, because he already had a record contract as a solo artist with Capitol Records. He already had a pretty successful career as a session musician. He doesn't need to go off and do one-nighters and be 1/5 of whatever the Beach Boys are doing. He's already well on his way. I suspect that Glen Campbell's absence has something to do with getting the Guess I'm Dumb single set up. And I suspect there's some Brian Wilson collusion with what happened here, but I can't prove any of this. Suffice it to say that for some reason, Glen suddenly couldn't do the gigs. And so Mike Love calls Bruce Johnston because Bruce knew a lot of players, and Bruce calls everybody he knows to go do the gig, including Ed Carter, the Beach Boys' future bass player, who couldn't do it because he had finals. And he couldn't find anybody, so he calls back Mike and says, look, I can't play bass, I play piano, but if you need me to, I can do the vocal parts. And so he gets on a plane and he goes and does apparently 3 shows with them, just bang, with no rehearsal or anything. Now, I always wonder what the hell happened here, because you don't just suddenly pick up a bass and sing high harmony over it with no rehearsal. But I don't care how good of a piano player you are, and he was a very good piano player. But that takes a little adjustment. That's not instantly in your wheelhouse. If you were a guitar player, I could see doing that. The only evidence I've ever heard that Bruce could play guitar was Jerry Cole, who was one of the Wrecking Crew guys, once told me that Bruce Johnston impressed him a lot with his guitar playing. But I think that this was an apocryphal memory of Jerry's. I don't think he was remembering the same guy, because I've never seen any other evidence that Bruce could play much guitar. I mean, he did play mandolin a little bit later on some Beach Boys sessions, so he probably had some rudimentary knowledge of the instrument, but there's no evidence he was a good enough guitar player to suddenly pick up a bass and get up on stage and go, wah! So I've always been puzzled about how this went down, and I actually talked to Craig Sawinski about this, and he explained what happened is that Bruce told Mike that if he rented an electric piano, Bruce could come down and sing the parts. So what seems to have happened is that Bruce flew in, played piano, sang Brian's parts, and then Al went back to playing bass. And then when Glen Campbell was able to come back and do the rest of the shows, then Carl taught Bruce the songs on the bass. And so Bruce had about a month before he goes on stage May 19th as a professional bass player, which is impressive for somebody that had never done that before. But for a musician of Bruce's caliber, if he had a month, and it's all rote learning. Remember, for the Beach Boys, you don't need to shred, you don't need to improvise, but you need to be able to rote learn difficult parts. And somebody as bright as Bruce and with enough musical background, I mean, if you know that much piano, the music theory of playing bass, there's nothing to it. It's all going to be the muscle memory of actually physically manipulating the frets and everything like that. So yeah, it's pretty impressive he was able to do that in a month, but I can easily believe that someone of Bruce's caliber could have done it, and he did. And what's interesting about the decision, because Bruce stayed on bass until he left in 1972, and I mean, yes, he did start to get moved over into organ, and they did get other people to play the bass as sidemen, but he was still playing a lot of bass and playing bass at a pretty high level right up to the point that he left the band. He wasn't just, you know, it's not like it is now, he's just clapping his hands. And no, he was an integral part of the stage band. And in this era, when they were still a self-contained band, this was a pretty circumstantial decision to have Bruce be in the band, because they took a big hit when Brian left. Brian was a pretty solid bass player, and he evolved a groove with Dennis and Carl. The band was pretty tight. And I'm sure that Glen Campbell did a wonderful job holding it down, because he's a fantastic musician. But once you get Bruce in, you've got essentially an amateur bass player, a very highly skilled musician, but an amateur bass player. You've got Al Jardine, who was competent, but probably not as good of a live guitar player as David Marks was. Who's, you know, he seems to have been a little more strummy, you know, rocking, whereas Marks was more downstrokey, more precise. And so it looks like the priority here was that Bruce was a really good singer and he could handle high parts and he was a very quick learner. So it wasn't as big a deal that Bruce was not really a bass player. But this was going to have consequences as we get into the Pet Sounds and Smile part of their careers, because their material got more and more complex and it was harder and harder to pull off with 5 people. You've got Bruce on instruments on an instrument he's not super comfortable with, and later you get Al and Carl moving over to bass or playing on certain things that they're not super comfortable with. And if you listen to some of the live recordings they did in '66 and '67, a lot of them aren't that good. And it wasn't until the late '60s when they started getting a few more sidemen and everybody started to get more into their comfort zone of what they were good at and started to be able to focus more on the vocals, the band starts to get really, really solid. But the Beach Boys as a live band were fairly shaky in the 65 to 68 region, and some of that is because of the choice to have basically an amateur bass player. And again, I'm not taking anything away from Bruce. He's an incredible musician. To be able to just jump into that role without any after a month that shows you what a good musician he is. But you didn't have anybody on the stage except Carl, who was a really, really solid, great player. I mean, Dennis was very, very good at what he did. Al had his little wheelhouse, but they were both limited players. Love them. I especially love what Dennis does as a musician, but they had their limitations. And by putting Bruce on bass, you're shrinking his ability to contribute somewhat too. He's not in his comfort zone. So what's interesting about this is that you see what the band's priorities were, which was to have a great singer and also somebody who was readily available and could do the gigs, you know, and their instrumental ability was secondary to those two concerns. And I think there was a third thing coming into play, and this brings us to Bruce's full membership in the band, because much to his surprise, when they get off the road, Bruce is invited to the Beach Boys recording sessions to sing. And the first song he sings on is California Girls, and not only does he sing on it, but he gets a very prominent descant part on the fade out. The second, Wish They All Could Be California, is Bruce. He's right there front and center. And Bruce was very surprised at this. He was surprised he was kept on in the stage band. He was surprised he was added to the studio band. And why did this happen? Well, I think it's very significant that Bruce was not a Hawthorne guy. And Bruce was an industry pro. And there's a really interesting bit of studio patter on the tape for the May 24th, 1965 session for And Your Dream Comes True, when the band are cutting for the Summer Days and Summer Nights album. And Bruce is not, he's not recording the vocals, he's in the booth and he's listening to the guys, and Brian actually asked Bruce for feedback. He says to Bruce, how was it? And Bruce says it was good. And Brian nudges him and Bruce goes, it was good, it wasn't great. And the thing is, you think about, you know, Bruce's track record, his position in the industry, even though he was a new guy and, you know, he was very much a hard hand and politically he was the low man on the totem pole, but on another sense, he existed in a realm totally beyond the whole Hawthorne family deal. He had a track record. He was, in a sense, a ringer. He was somebody that had the confidence and the expertise to be a sounding board for Brian. And also, he was the guy who was professional enough and divorced enough from family ties that if Brian gave him a part, a really difficult part, Bruce would execute it perfectly and without any drama, any politics, any nonsense. And I think Brian very much wanted Bruce there for that reason. Things were getting more and more complex. He was using more and more studio musicians. Resistance within the band, and because of the family structure, was starting to grow to what he was doing. So having someone like Bruce, who was a little bit of an outsider and who was a fan of the band and wasn't going to challenge Brian on a family level, like, hey bro, hey cuz, I don't really want to do this. Bruce Johnston was never going to do that. And Bruce was going to come at the assignment from the standpoint of somebody who had been doing sessions and productions forever. So if you look at it from that respect, Bruce would have been an invaluable part of Brian's advancement in the coming years as a singer and as somebody in the studio that was just going to show up and do his job and not give Brian a lot of flack. So as we look forward with Bruce's history in the band, it's really kind of interesting because Bruce's position all through the 60s is kind of wobbly. They nearly replaced him at one point. There's a couple other points where it looks like he was ready to leave the band. And again, this kind of goes back to the fact that the Beach Boys, while it was an assignment Bruce took seriously, and he was a big booster of the group, especially during the Pet Sounds era when he actually did his own little promotional junket to England to promote the album, something none of the other guys would have had the savvy to do. Bruce always seemed to have one foot out the door. And, like Glen Campbell, he didn't need the Beach Boys to be successful. And as we look into the period in the 70s when he left the band, we'll see that Bruce racked up a whole nother slew of successes as a producer, songwriter, and as a session singer. And we'll probably do a Bruce Part 2 when we get up to the 70s. So Bruce was a guy that he fit into the Beach Boys in some respects because he had the chops. He'd already been doing Beach Boys sound-alike records for a couple of years. He had the vocal chops. Although, interestingly, he didn't wind up doing a lot of Brian's stuff on stage. That wound up being Al, which is kind of interesting. And I think it probably was because Bruce had a more delicate voice than Al. He hadn't done as much stage singing as Beach Boys had at that point. And I think that especially because of what happened to Bruce's voice after he became a full-time touring musician. It got kind of hoarse, it got a little weaker. So I think that was a voice conservation decision to have Al Jardine do the falsettos on stage instead of Bruce. But Bruce's falsetto was featured almost immediately from the get-go on the first track of their next album, Summer Days and Summer Nights, and he sounds terrific. In fact, I'm a big fan of Bruce Johnston's falsetto. I wish they had used it more often. But vocally fitting in and having the ear for the production style, and like I said, being a ringer, being a pro, being somebody that knew the vocabulary of the studio and the vocabulary of the industry in a way that the Hawthorne crew had to learn, that was really valuable for the band. But he wasn't going to be the guy that was going to write their next hit single. He wasn't going to be the guy that was going to produce the next hit single, because what he did on his own didn't quite fit the band. And this is something Bruce has said himself a number of times. I mean, there were exceptions, like Disney Girls, for example, but he wasn't going to be able to step up and fill the void that Brian left. He couldn't really anyway because he wasn't part of the inner circle, but he had the chops uniquely in the band he could produce, he could write, he could sing, but he didn't fill that role partly because he wasn't part of this sort of Hawthorne inner circle. He's a little too much of an outsider, but also the skill set that he had in that area didn't quite fit where the band needed to go. And to his credit, Bruce knew that. And he was very conscious of what roles he could play in the band that were productive and what areas he needed to lay out in. And in that sort of quasi-political, quasi-musical way, that's a big part of why Bruce has been able to stay a part of the Beach Boys story up to this present day. He's very adept at knowing what role he needs to fill, and as an old hand and an old industry pro, he does it. And that is a skill, and that is a rare skill, and it's something we need to give up respect for. So, when you see, not that guy, although he's pretty good too, when you see this guy on stage and you see him futzing with his mic stand and his little shorts and, doing that, and you think, what's that guy about? Well, that's the guy that helped invent California music, and that's the 80-year-old that got a track on The Weeknd's new album and won a Grammy for Song of the Year, who was away from the band. Bruce Johnston, badass. And that brings us up to Summer Days and Summer Nights, which we'll be reviewing in our next episode. We will be back very, very soon. Again, if you want to support the channel and keep it going, we do have a Patreon and a place to donate through PayPal. That's in the first comment. And I'll leave it at that and go dry off. I am Adam Marsland, your host. Thanks so much for watching Pet Squares today.